Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Matthew Joby, and welcome to our first lecture on the psychology of religion here at Rutgers Newark. Where to start with this? I think I'd like to start with a little bit of an anecdote. When I first took psychology, I entered psychology a little later in life. In my late 20s, I decided to go back to college and get a degree in psychology. And in my first course, which was an introduction to psychology course taught by a psychologist from the cognitive perspective, cognitive psychologist, someone who placed value on experimental research methods, who placed value on seeking out cause and effect relationships and between stimulus, organism, and response. Someone who approached the natural science methodology in psychology. And a student, within the first week or two of class, a student brought something up in class to do with their religious belief, a spiritual belief. And the professor stopped her and said, "Leave your religion at the door." And that was the last discussion of religion or spirituality that took place in my undergraduate education in psychology, with the exception of one professor who taught clinical psychology, and he turned us on to some of the central aspects of spirituality and religion as part of the human condition. I was alarmed. I couldn't believe my ears. When I heard this professor say, "Leave your religion at the door," I had entered into psychology as an artist. I had spent 6 years in music conservatories, studying music, art school for the years. And I had a very art-based sensibility about the human condition. As a matter of fact, many of the reasons that I was entering into psychology was in fact to answer some questions or to explore some questions. I found very few answers. No, let me rephrase that. I found many answers. No answer. And a lot of exploring. I've become familiar with the questions and the multiplicity of answers to those questions. And my interest was really in something that was spiritual. For me, music is a form of spirituality. It's a celebration of spirituality. If we define religion as Erich Fromm did in his famous book, Religion and Psychoanalysis, Fromm says that religion is marked by satisfying a need for a belongingness to a community. Well, we have that in music. When we get together at the jazz club as either performers or listeners, or if we're playing in a symphony orchestra, or we go to the opera, we're going to a place that becomes like a sacred place. And we're communing. We're being with others for a common interest. We find social support in that setting, be it a conventional place of worship in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, in the Taoist tradition, in the Vedic Hindu tradition, in the Buddhist tradition. Whatever the world tradition is, in the orchestral tradition, the jazz tradition, we have a community of people that we go to in times of celebration, in times of need, in times of mourning, where we become part of a social group. And it turns out that social group is very like-minded in approach to solutions, approach to living. So there's two aspects that we can understand religion, spirituality. Thirdly, it answers big questions. There's four big questions. There's big four existential questions. You know what they are? Why am I here? What's my purpose? What should I do while I'm here? Free will, choice. What is my responsibility based on free will, based on choice? And fourth, impermanency, the eventual inevitability of my mortality. Those are the big four existential questions. And of course, these are the big questions that religion and spirituality address in any shape or form, whether that be, again, in one of the world religious traditions or in a non-structured spiritual setting like art, the orchestra hall, the jazz club. I would even venture to say that we can understand dance clubs and this culture, this dance club culture, or any type of cultural group that come together as forming some sort of a religious sect that has rituals, that has community, that has history. It gives a sense of purpose and meaning in one's life. That, to me, is essential to the human condition. That is psychology. So you can imagine that when this professor said, check your religion in at the door, I was at first baffled because I was being introduced to a new way of thinking. And I then became skeptical. That was 20 years ago. And my gut reaction was dead on. I've explored these topics now for, as I said, for over 20 years. And what you're going to experience here in this course is my invitation to you to bring your religion in the door with you, if anything, and maybe reconsider what it is you consider or limit religion and spirituality to be. Hopefully we're going to understand that this is central to the human condition, to ways of being in the world. Central to our style of life, as Adler would call it, our personality style, our way of approaching life. So this is the spirit in which we're going to explore these issues together. I would say that broadly speaking, psychology can be understood as being represented by two major approaches. And these two major approaches are the natural science approach. The natural science approach is viewing psychology as a natural science, such as chemistry or biology. This is very popular today in neuroscience and cognitive neuropsychology, cognitive behavioral psychology. It's looking for cause and effect relationships. It's looking for strong correlational relationships. It's very quantitative. In other words, it focuses on statistics. And it focuses on understanding through knowing. This is opposed to, or contrasted with, humanities-based psychology. We might also call this human sciences psychology, but don't let the word science confuse you here. Because a human science or humanities-based psychology is less interested in cause and effect, less interested in quantitative statistical research, possibly even opposed to experimental research and correlational research, and more interested in understanding over knowing, more interested in description, and more interested in getting to know the phenomenon that's being explored. So these psychologists, the humanities-based psychologists, are interested in descriptive rather than control, rather than the goals of science are to predict control and change. That would be natural scientific psychology. The goals of a humanities-based psychologist would be to describe, to understand, to experience, to become aware of. So in our course, we're going to explore the phenomenon of religion and spirituality through both of these perspectives. We're going to, in this course, take a look firstly at William James's first treatise on the varieties of religious experience, 1902 text. We're going to discuss this today. And we're going to then move on to Gordon Allport's famous text on the psychology of religion, the individual and his religion. And that's going to take a humanistic approach, the humanities-based psychology. We're going to look then at neuroscientific, biological discussion of psychology. That would be the natural science perspective. We're then going to look at Freud and Jung and their explanations through a psychodynamic approach to religion, which is more of a humanistic, humanities, human science tradition. We're then going to look at evolutionary psychology, which is more of a natural science approach, which seems to be rather open to some phenomenological humanities type explorations. So this is going to be a fascinating course because we're going to be looking at a variety of different perspectives on religion and spirituality and the religious experience. However, we're not going to take one exclusive, conclusive view of it. In complete disclosure, I've studied natural science psychology. Of course, we all have to at some point in graduate school to work as psychologists in training. So I've studied the neuroscience, I've studied the cognitive psychology, I've studied the biological, endocrine, genetic, and nervous system psychologies, studied a lot of evolutionary psychology. But I'm at home in humanities-based psychology. My graduate work and master's degree was in psychodynamic psychology. My Ph.D. was in phenomenological existential psychology and humanism. So you will have a strong influence of that. It could even be one of the motivators for me teaching a course in the psychology of religion. Because in my experience, spirituality and the religious experience is central to the human condition. So that's the spirit in which we're going to do this. So what I would do now is maybe pause the video, stop the video, and go to your William James 1902 text, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and read the preface, chapters 1 and chapter 2. And if you're really intrigued and really turned on by what William James has to say, go to chapter 20. The in-between stuff saved for graduate school. But this is going to be our exploration of the first American psychological exploration of the religious experience. So James, you can find your book, either get a paperback version or go to the archive.org link to read it. So James wrote this in between 1901 and 1902. It's a collection of lectures, 20 lectures. It's over 500 pages long, so you're not going to be able to sit down and read this entire book during this course, but just the 2 chapters that I've prescribed are enough to get the gist of this, to get the point. William James was America's first academic psychologist. He started the psychology department at Harvard University, and in fact he wrote these lectures. There's a series of lectures while a professor at Harvard, and he was invited to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland to deliver these lectures. Now, just to keep this in perspective, the fact that an American psychologist, and at the time James was the most famous American psychologist. He had just published in 1890 his 2-volume work, The Principles of Psychology. And this was his first major psychological text. This is a text that even today, I often tell my students I keep a copy of this on my bookshelf next to my desk. And every time I'm looking into something, I'm searching, or researching, depending on the mood, I say to myself, what did James have to say about this? So whether it's the personality of the self, or it's dreams, or the way the mind-body connection, all these things. I look and I see what James has to say, and it's striking that James typically is entirely relevant today. And we're finding more and more, especially in evolutionary psychology, that folks are turning more towards James than any other psychologist of the past. James was truly a person ahead of his time. He embraced something called radical empiricism. What is radical empiricism? Well, it's the idea that we don't limit ourselves to the methodologies of one perspective. It would be, in essence, the opposite of the professor who says, check your religion in at the door. We only talk about what's observable and measurable. For James, if we only talk about the observable and the measurable, the just strict empiricism of natural science of the 19th century that so many adhere to today yet, if we limit it, we're only seeing one aspect of the phenomenon. We have to look at the biology. We have to look at the empirical, the quantitative, but we can't limit ourselves to this. This is radical empiricism. This is looking outside. This is reading novels. This is listening to conversations, having conversations and listening to people who are religious, who are spiritual, who have had the spiritual experience. If you go to certain Pentecostal charismatic Christian services, you'll see expressions of exuberance and joy. People speaking in tongues. Some people losing bodily control. Some people experiencing healings, faith healings. Some individuals, the musicians, being part of the worship service. When someone like the Baptist revivalist organist Corey Henry begins playing, and he's improvising, and he's shouting on the organ against the preacher. They say that the Spirit has gotten into him. He's caught the Spirit. This exuberance that occurs. These are transcendent experiences. We have conversations with these people. And we don't come to any definite quantitative knowledge, but James says we come to a qualitative understanding that adds depth, multidimensional depth. James said if we only look at the natural scientific, if we only look at the quantitative, the numerical, statistical, we get a one-dimensional point of view. If we look at the quantitative and the qualitative, the humanities-based and the natural science-based, we get a more fleshed out view of the phenomenon. That's what James referred to as radical empiricism. His idea of pragmatism, which was the basis of his philosophy, was that things can be true without being real. What does this mean? This means that we can find things, theories, models that work to help us to understand and even to explain that aren't necessarily real. They're true because they offer some way for us to get a grasp on things, to help us to understand, but it's not necessarily real. For example, if people who have a strong belief in prayer, if they pray, say before an exam, it turns out quantitatively that individuals who believe in prayer, if they pray before a test, will do better on a test or will recover better from a medical situation or things like this. From a psychological point of view, we would ask the question of where the power comes from. Is it the belief in prayer or is it the prayer itself? You see, something doesn't have to be real for it to be true. It could be the belief in the prayer itself that changes one's disposition, attitude, state of being in the moment to help them perform better, helps their immune system kick in, things of this nature. You don't have to be worried, because ultimately it doesn't really matter where it comes from. It's the belief that matters. It's the belief that matters. So according to James and pragmatism, if your truth is that God is helping you with your test scores or with your health, and that works, then that's important. That's where the questioning ends. But we'd remain intellectually humble enough as psychologists to understand that the truth might not be real. And ultimately, we can't touch on the real. We can only talk about the theoretical truths, as long as it works. So that's the idea of pragmatism, theoretical pragmatism. Functionalism is another word that's used for James's approach, and in this James functionalism is not asking what is the mind, not asking for what are the components of decision-making processes in the mind, like in cognitive psychology, but rather what is the function of the mind. And this speaks towards evolutionary psychology. So, for example, asking the question, what purpose does spiritual or religious practice serve an individual's life? That would be the important question. How the function of religion, the function of spirituality. Now that takes us through much of what's discussed in the preface of James's book. He also makes note that he's an American speaking in Europe. Why is this such a big deal? Well, in the 19th century, even into the 20th century, America and the American intellectual scene had a bit of an inferiority complex to the Europeans. It turns out that our colonial ancestors had more college graduates and more colleges per person than Europe had. So we've always had more institutions and more college-educated individuals, even in colonial days. In the first days, a lot of the people who came here from Europe were intellectual exiles, people who thought, disagreed with the church, disagreed with the government, and left. And typically, people who are the revolutionaries are people who read, people who are educated. And it doesn't necessarily mean there's a degree on the wall. You can be an intellectual, you can be educated by approaching and embracing information, reading, listening to others, thinking, writing. It just so happens that college is those things that you do all that in. So he says, why am I an American here doing this? And he goes on to very politically and very politely state his pride in the American intellectual tradition, and also the honor it is that he is being accepted in Europe as a world scholar, as an intellectual. James says, religious happiness is human happiness. Religious trance is human trance. In other words, he's saying this is the subject matter of psychology simply because happiness is a human condition. Religious happiness is a variation of happiness. Going into a trance, whether it be hypnosis or meditation, or a religious experience, a spiritual trance that we see in some spiritual practices. This is not a religious experience. This is a human experience in a spiritual expression, in a human expression. So James was interested in the religious experience, not necessarily in religion. What he tells us is that he planned a two-section work. The first section would be what he called the philosophy of religion. The second would be the institution of religion. We can understand this as he does in Lecture 1 of external religion versus internal religion. What's external religion? Well, external religion would be the building, the structure of the hierarchy, the clergy and the people involved, the monks and the clergy who devote their life to a certain religion, the rank and order, the rules, the prescripts, all of these things, the religious texts, that's all external religion. This he differentiates from internal religion, which is the individual's experience of religion. You notice the title of this book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. What James found was after lecturing for 20 lectures, after doing his research and lecturing for 20 lectures, he found that there was no room left to worry about the structure of the religion. The monks and the priests and the nuns, whatever the specific name for the clergy of the individual religion, external religion, self. This was not of his interest. He was devoted all 20 lectures, all 500 plus pages, to the internal religious experience. I hope you can make this distinction. Maybe even think for yourselves, what are the differences between your internal religious experience and external religion? Today we might make a distinction between religion and spirituality. James used these words as internal religion versus external institutional religion. I had a conversation the other day with someone I met, and he was very upset. He had grown up in Roman Catholic, and he was very upset about all of the corruption and abuses that have taken place and have come to light in Catholicism. And he had turned completely to atheism and science, because this just felt safer to him. And of course, this is his journey. It's his time on earth. And we all have to do our own, whatever's right for us. We have to explore in our own way. However, he did solicit the conversation. After he learned that I was a psychologist, he asked me what my views on religion were. And Alan Watts often said, unsolicited advice is always self-serving. So I usually don't tell people my thoughts unless they ask me. And some people think that this is kind of being standoffish. I have my opinions, of course, and I have the truths that I experience and work for me, and when they stop working for me, I throw them out, or I re-examine what's going on in my life around that for more self-knowledge. But this individual did ask me my opinion, so I shared it with him. And he told me that he had turned away from religion because of its power structures and the power abuses that took place specifically in Catholicism. So it just so happened that I just finished reading James, and I asked him the question. It's often good to ask questions. I asked him the question. I said, well, when you say religion, what do you mean by religion? And he looked at me as if I were maybe not so smart. I said, what do you mean by religion? And it turns out that he was lumping all of religion together. In other words, the institution, the priests, the nuns, the power structures, the hierarchies, the rules, sins and non-sin, etc., and the internal experience of religion and spirituality. This was all one big thing for him. And I listened to him, to his reply, and it became apparent that it became apparent that he wasn't viewing this in maybe a nuanced way. Imagine you go to a restaurant and you ask the waiter or the waitress, the server, what kind of wine do you have? And they say red or white. Now, if you're a wine connoisseur, that's probably not the restaurant you want to have wine in. If you ask them what kinds of wine they have and they say red or white, it's a rather unsophisticated or unsensitive variety. If you go to a place where there's a nuanced approach to the wine, of course you're going to have a wine list, many different reds from the United States, from New York, from California, from Washington State, from Europe, Australia, all different parts of the world. And you're going to have the reds and you're going to have the whites. You see, this is a much more sensitive approach. So I asked him what his take on religion, what he meant by religion, and I found that it was a rather, it was useful to him. It got him dislodged from whatever he had gone through in his religious experience. It turned him off. It dislodged him from that, gave him liberation. But I wondered if maybe he was throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I proceeded to tell him about William James. So my friendly conversation on the beach turned out to be a lecture on William James. Very similar to what was good practice for what I'm offering you here today. And I told him what James' thoughts were in the varieties, the different religious experiences of an individual versus externalized religion, or what we might call today institutionalized religion versus personal spirituality. And I think it's pretty common for all of us that unless we're accustomed to remaining open to new experiences, to new options, to new insights into, using something like a raft across the river, and once we get to the river, once we get to the other side, letting the raft go because we no longer need it. Sometimes we come to a conclusion. I think this individual, this guy, he came to a conclusion about religion. It worked for him. It got him dislodged. It must have been a very brave step to free himself from his youthful indoctrination, especially in family and acceptance and feelings of self-worth are wrapped up in all of these religious ties. He liberated himself from this, but I wondered, is it possible that he could benefit from maybe a little more nuanced understanding of the word religion and spirituality via James? So I explained to him the difference that James made, the distinction that James made between externalized institutional religion and spiritual religious internal experience. And there was a little bit of, at first, he resisted this. He wanted to hold on because it probably is fearful that he's going to get sucked back into this abusive power structure. But what I asked, I began to tell him about my experience with music as a spiritual act. Going to the jazz club and seeing my friends and people I care about during good times, during bad times. When someone in our community passes away, we meet up at the club, usually the evening of their death, and we all get together and talk and make music and remember and weep and laugh and all these spiritual experiences. And I shared with him that my idea of spirituality was one based on James's idea, that we can learn from things without necessarily being clingy and attached to the ideas. So in James' writings, what we find is a willingness to read the text, the Vedic texts, the Hindu texts, Tibetan Buddhist texts, Zen Buddhist texts, the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition texts, the texts of the world's ancient mythologies, and to take useful information from those texts and teachings without necessarily having to agree with them or believe in them wholesale. And I think that's a good attitude to take through this course. Let's hear what these people have to say. Let's hear what William James has to say. Let's hear what Gordon Allport has to say. Let's hear what V.S. Ramachandran has to say. Let's hear what Nick Humphrey has to say. And let's take these into consideration. And hopefully, when we get out of this together, we'll have a more fleshed out understanding of the religious experience.